Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. It is my pleasure to open this exciting event, which will surely be enriching and powerful. My name is Dr. Camille Wilson. I am a professor of education and a university diversity and social transformation professor here at the University of Michigan. I am also the founding director of the CREATE Center. I know we have dozens of attendees zooming in from across the country, including community-based organizations, and it is a pleasure to have you all here with us in this virtual space. CREATE stands for Community-Based Research on Equity, Activism, and Transformative Education. A key part of the CREATE Center's mission involves uniting university researchers and community advocates and activists to pursue the shared goals of advancing equitable and anti-racist educational practice, policy, and inquiry. This is the center's first year. We are a research center that supports various research initiatives that link university and community members, yet we also offer programming and engage in research-informed advocacy. This afternoon's event is the second of our Community Engaged series. Today, we have three remarkable justice workers joining us to address the theme Partners for Liberation, Researching and Organizing for Educational and Racial Justice. Very soon, you will hear more about our guests' professional backgrounds, but I want to first welcome them on a personal note. First, I want to welcome our keynote speaker, Dr. Adrienne Dixson, who is not only a leading critical race scholar, she's also an alumna of the University of Michigan. We first met as master's students in the School of Education in the mid-1990s and have been great friends ever since. Adrienne, also known as Dr. Dixson, I'm so honored to have the opportunity to welcome you back. This is a special full circle moment for me personally. It also one I think and hope will be especially inspiring to the students that we have in the audience with us today. You exemplify what it looks like to learn and then leave U of M and then build an influential career that is both academic and community-based and one that is steeped in social justice commitments. I also want to offer a warm welcome to Ms. Karen Marshall, who is joining us from New Orleans. I've learned so much about the plight, fight, risk, sacrifice, and genius of New Orleans educational justice workers, not only from Dr. Dixon's efforts, but so poignantly from New Orleans parent organizers and activists who are in the trenches every day, working to save and improve public education for all children, and especially for Black children, who are routinely denied educational access and quality. So I want to thank you, Karen, for all the work that you do and your leadership. So excited to have you. Third, we will hear from Ms. Arlyssa Hurd, a Detroit-based community organizer with whom I've had the privilege to collaborate with across the years. Indeed, the Research to Practice partnership that was the CREATE study, which I co-led with 482 Forward, was a huge inspiration to the establishment of the CREATE Center. So Arlyssa, also just a pleasure to have you. I've been in so many spaces with you over the years, from Detroit neighborhoods to the steps of the state capitol in Lansing, to community members and community rallies and meetings. And I've listened and learned from you in awe of your brilliance, commitment, and leadership. Like Karen, you are in the trenches fighting for just and democratic schools every day. And we are so fortunate to have you with us as well. I want to further recognize the privilege we all have today in being able to learn from each of our three guests. This event prompts us to explicitly recognize and affirm the labor and activism of Black women in various educational spaces, from K-12 schools to post-secondary education to community-based organizing, teaching, and learning. Indeed, Black women have contributed mightily to justice movements throughout this country and the world via our intellect, critical care, coalition building, and leadership. We at the CREATE Center are grateful for the University of Michigan Center for the Education of Women for co-sponsoring this event. I also want to thank Dr. Tanya Neff Chang, a visiting scholar here at the CREATE Center, who helped coordinate today's event with me. During our time together, she will be dropping links to education organizing resources in the Zoom chat. We are also captioning the event to ensure as much accessibility as possible. So please know that you can adjust the captions by clicking the live transcript option, and this should appear in the bottom right of your Zoom menu. If you have questions about this, please post it in the Q&A or chat, and Dr. Nefching will help. So now I'd like to welcome the moderator for today's event, Dr. Kimberly Ransom. Dr. Ransom is a postdoctoral research fellow at the CREATE Center, who has been a wonderful co-leader during the center's launching year. She is an interdisciplinary historian who studies the history of African-American education and the history of childhood. As a public scholar and artist, Dr. Ransom also uses her historical research to create public exhibits related to African-American childhood in and around schools. She too is an alumna of our School of Education and has great insight about partnering for liberation and justice. In her most recent project, she partnered with community members who were also her dissertation study participants to create a local museum in the sole remaining Rosenwall Schoolhouse in Pickens County, Alabama. So thank you for moderating today, Dr. Ransom, and I will pass it to you to further introduce our guest.
You're muted.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon, everyone. I will now introduce our esteemed guest. First, Dr. Adrienne Dixson is a prominent critical race theory scholar and education professor at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Dr. Dixson examines the intersectionality of race, class, and gender in urban educational contexts, particularly how they impact educational equity for students and people of color in the urban South. Dr. Dixon's current projects include an NSF-funded project examining community-based STEM programs, a Spencer Foundation funded project investigating how public engagement via radio programming informs educational research, and a Kellogg Foundation funded project examining how high-quality professional development impacts culturally relevant pedagogy and Black teacher retention in New Orleans. Professor Dixson is an alumna of the University of Michigan School of Education, and today she will share her experiences as an educational researcher collaborating with community partners. Specifically, her talk today will focus on her journey toward researching and organizing for justice, how she approaches and negotiates equitable partnerships with community members, and the impact and importance of being a critical race scholar. Karen Marshall, our next speaker, is an educator, organizer, and coach of the basketball variety, who currently serves as the executive director of Kids Rethink New Orleans Schools in Louisiana. Rethink supports Black youth's critical analysis, leadership development, community engagement, and transformational change. The Rethinkers seek to elevate youth voices in their collective advocacy for equitable education. And our final speaker will be Ms. Arlyssa Hurd, who is an organizer and policy lead at 482 Forward, a Detroit-based organization of educational justice community organizers. Ms. Hurd is also a current board member on the Focus Hope Village Steering Committee. As the mother of 2 boys, she is also an active Mamavist, a board member for the grassroots organization Mothering Justice. She also serves on the Parent Advisory Council of the Children's Center in Detroit. Ms. Hurd graduated from Northwood University with a degree in accounting and a BA in business administration. She began her work in research and evaluation at Michigan State University's Department of Psychiatry, assessing local family intervention programs. Soon after this work, she started educating families and advocating for children at the Detroit Health Department. As a mother of a child with sickle cell anemia, she has also been a statewide voice for parents while serving as a board member for the Children's Special Health Care Services. In 2014, Arlyssa ran as a first-timer for the Detroit Public School Board. securing over 25,000 votes. Ms. Hurd has also served on several parent advisory councils for Detroit Public Schools and Grassroots Neighborhood Community Council. Please join me in welcoming all of our wonderful speakers for today. Please note, Dr. Dixson will offer her keynote address, and then following Dr. Dixson, we will have commentary from our community activists, Ms. Marshall, Ms. Hurd, and finally, Dr. Dixon. Also, please note, in the interest of time, as your moderator for today's talk, I will be providing our speakers with a courtesy 2-minute signal to mark the end of their time. So without further ado, we will begin with our keynote, Dr. Adrienne Dixson. Dr. Dixon.
Good afternoon. Thank you to everyone. Thank you, Camille, for this opportunity, and Tanya for organizing. She was an organizer extraordinaire. And Kimberly, I appreciate having you here, my soror, here to moderate this event. Yes, thank you. So I want to start, and I'm a professor, so it's going to be long-winded and circuitous, but I'm going to try to talk about the work that I'm doing in New Orleans as a way of getting at our topic around, I hasten to say activism, but really supporting community-based efforts for liberatory education, particularly as it pertains to students of color and African-American students in particular. So for the last, now maybe 7 years, I've been thinking really carefully about the way that we research and understand educational racial inequality. And my interest has always been in urban education. So while I've asked questions and looked at schooling contexts that disproportionately impacted African-American kids negatively, I have just recently started to think about what does the process of that research look like? And in thinking about the research piece, obviously what became most prominent is what it means to work in community and work with people towards a kind of meaningful set of outcomes that we may not see them immediately, but that we're building towards something. And so I've been inclined to having my research be meaningful in terms of change. I wasn't always conscious of myself as someone who participated in overtly political projects in terms of organizing and change. I always saw myself as sort of someone in the background and just trying to make sense of it. And I'll talk a little bit about my project in New Orleans as a way to kind of get to the activism piece, although I hasten to use the term activism. So I want to talk a little bit about my background, the project in New Orleans, and then what I think the research implications are in terms of, again, for lack of a better word, kind of activism, community-based partnerships, and working towards liberation. And so this picture that you see here is Andrew J. Bell Junior High School was a school that existed prior on August 28th, 2005. It was a school after August 29th, 2005, when the city was hit with Hurricane Katrina and the subsequent flooding that actually devastated the city. So it wasn't the hurricane per se, it was the flooding. Many of our obviously the education landscape was transformed. And buildings were impacted by the hurricane, but what was more impactful were the decisions that people made about what would happen to these buildings, literally who would inhabit them, and then what would it mean for people? What would those buildings mean in those communities? And as the communities are being reshaped, obviously the buildings are too. So Andrew Bell does now not exist as a school. And I took this picture only a few years ago in many of the buildings that are still standing. In fact, I don't know if I have a picture of my former school building. I taught at Charles E. Guy Elementary School, which sits at the corner of North Robertson and Franklin Avenue. Until I think the sign is still there, but these signs were up right before everyone evacuated the city. So they hadn't changed. And I say they serve as kind of a reminder of what used to be, and also a reminder of kind of the trauma, the collective trauma that people in New Orleans have experienced, particularly Black people who lived in these communities where these schools existed. And the schools have had special meaning for Black people in the city, and are examples of kind of the trauma and oppression that exists now as schools have been quote unquote transformed because of ed reform. So I have that there to, kind of set the tone. All right. Oh, this is my school, so I did keep that in. So I taught at Charles E. Guy. This picture is from 2011, but actually I think the sign is still there because the building is being repurposed. So Charles Andrew Bell has been remade into a quote unquote artist village. And maybe KG can speak to this because I'm not sure who lives in the building, in the Andrew Bell building. A similar fate will happen for Guy Ray. It will be repurposed. Many of the schools that didn't reopen and didn't actually, Guy Ray had minimal damage, didn't reopen as schools. They've been repurposed into either apartments, condos, or one building was turned into a eatery. So it was refashioned as a market, a marketplace, a grocery store with hot food offered, and then small vendor spaces. And a number of schools in the city have been refashioned into sort of buildings like this. And so I think that's a similar fate for Guy Ray. So the research questions that I started with, let me go back. The research questions that I started with is kind of what happens to traditional public schooling when traditional public schooling is replaced by a hybrid free market model. And by hybrid, I meant and we are in this kind of hybrid model where there is an elected school board, but schools are operated by quasi-public entities, so charter management organizations. I'm sure those of you in Detroit are familiar because the Detroit ed reformers come to Detroit and try to implement the New Orleans model. Other places have fully implemented the New Orleans model. It obviously didn't work in Detroit, but in New Orleans, we have a hybrid free market model where, again, we have an elected school board, but we have schools that are governed exclusively by an unelected board of people from the city, some in private sector, very few, if any, are parents who are, regular rank and file citizens. So it's a free market model. What happens when school systems are transformed in this way? And then how do these reforms impact communities of color, specifically as it relates to educational and racial equity? So these were my initial questions that I started with back in 2007. I've been engaged in this work for now 14 years. And the nature of the questions have, in some ways, shaped my increasing participation in organizing efforts in New Orleans. So I am informed by critical race theory. I won't say a lot about it, but one of the things that I think is important about critical race theory is that we are really interested in how so-called race neutral policies in fact exacerbate existing racial inequalities and then create their own. So the kind of public rhetoric around education reform in New Orleans after Katrina was that it was supposed to address long-standing and historical educational racial inequality and racial segregation. And what it in fact has done has exacerbated that and created layers of racial segregation in schools that continues to privilege moneyed and elite whites in the city, to the extent that now elite whites that would have paid for private school essentially now have their own public education structure. So that they are not having to pay for private schools. Those who do are, we're already inclined to private schools, but many of the kind of selective admission charter schools, which is an oxymoron in many ways, given the kind of theory behind charter schools, but the selective admission charter schools almost service exclusively elite whites in the city and transplanted white people in the city. So they're located in specific geographic areas that are typically and historically predominantly white. And so one could move into New Orleans and claim participation in public education, but your children essentially attend 3 or 4 schools that are predominantly white, and again, reflective of kind of the historical power structure, white power structure in the city. So in terms of CRT, we kind of look at how, I tell my students it's the okie doke, how is kind of racial inequity, the racial inequity okie doke going to show up again in education policy, and that's what we kind of look for when we investigate, again, supposedly race neutral policies. And one of the kind of guiding pieces, and this has been even more important for me as my career as a researcher has continued to develop, and I have thought about the work being meaningful for those on the bottom, as Mari Matsuda talks about, is that those who lack material wealth or political power still have access to thought and language and their development of those tools and differ from that of the privileged. It reminds me to remain engaged and shapes my my practice as a researcher and someone from a university to not kind of enforce or to have my perspective overshadow those who are in the areas in which I am engaged in research. And so it's a reminder for me to kind of, in other words, check my privilege. We engage in counter stories. So a lot of what I've done over the last 14 years is kind of collect stories to create a counter story to the prevailing kind of narrative about the success of the reforms in New Orleans. The folks in which I engage and interact have a different narrative. The ed reformers had an incredible media structure and access to mainstream media. If everyone remembers NBC's Education Nation, in many ways was almost functioned as a kind of exclusive news arm for education reform, and particularly the reforms in New Orleans, having done a number of stories when they would come to New Orleans and film and host live events almost after every quote unquote anniversary of Katrina. So the kind of the representation of the reforms as being successful tended to mask the suffering, really, and the discrimination and oppression that people all across the education sector were experiencing, again, particularly Black and brown folks in New Orleans. And those are the stories that typically were not prominent. And so one of the aims of critical race theory is to provide those counter stories. And we do that by engaging with folks who are experiencing the racist phenomena. So the methods, it's an ongoing study. It's an emergent design in large part because, and this is again my interest in kind of how do we understand race research and how do we do it on the ground, is that the landscape was kind of constantly changing in terms of the players, in terms of policies, which schools were open, which were closed, who was the new school leader, who was in, who was out, if you will. And so the design, the design had to be dynamic and emergent. The number shifts because as people come, particularly with the Ed Reform Group, I've had opportunities to interview ed reformers. Some have left, obviously, and moved on to other places. Others have left the field, but remain in the city. Some have passed on. So it's been, the number of participants isn't as stable as I would like it to be, but it has grown a lot and is pretty vast. I tend to be really interested in how people of color, and in particular African Americans, are making sense of and experiencing the reform. So my sample tends to reflect that demographic. When possible, I've interviewed white informants, but that isn't the demographic that I target. Most of my work has been participant observation, and I do semi-structured interviews, and some have been mostly informal just because of the nature of the work. And again, why I'm calling it kind of a dynamic emergent design. When I am at events, people will share things with me, and I will have an opportunity to talk at length with them, but generally not with a tape recorder nearby. So much of what I've collected has been informal interviews. Okay. Again, multiple contexts: teachers union, meetings, community centers, community events, community meetings, schools when I've been able to access schools. So across multiple contexts. So I want to give kind of a picture of it so people can understand kind of what's led to this. Is the role of state legislatures. And again, if you look in Detroit, you can look in Memphis, in New Jersey, places that have adopted the reform, the legislatures have been very much a driver of the reforms, forming kind of shadow school districts, so the Recovery School District and others that take over public schools. I show this to show the complexity of what parents had to navigate. And when I've given talks about this, people, their eyes cross, and I'm like, this is what they've given to families. So this isn't even internal documents. This is what they offer to families that they vetted to say, will help you figure out how to apply to schools. And it's changed. So this is a little old, but this is what parents have had to use to try to figure out where to put their kids. Uh-oh, sorry. And this was 2016, 2017. It has since shifted because now they're all charter schools. I think 2017 was the last year where there was where schools were run by the elected board. Now they're all independent, and they're supposedly governed by the elected board, but they haven't quite figured out what the governance structure will look like. But again, this is what families get. Families get this graphic, and this is supposed to help them understand what schools are accessible, what schools exist, and what schools are open and that they can apply to. There were some challenges with enrollment. I'm gonna skip through this. And we know that most of the African-American kids are in C, D, and F schools, with them kind of concentrated in F schools. White students, for the most part, are in A and B schools, with most of them in A schools. Latino and Asian kids are kind of segregated, honestly, in a handful, and not even a handful of schools, but that's geographic segregation as well. They tend to be located in areas that are predominantly Latino and Asian. African-American students are spread literally across the city, which creates a challenge for community building. What are the implications of the reform? Increasing nonprofit organizations that provide auxiliary education services, and sometimes primary education services. So across every academic area you can think about, there is a nonprofit organization that is in a school offering a critical service. I say that there's a lot of curricular and pedagogical instability, variations across the school, so that a child could go from one school to the other and have a different set of textbooks and a different curriculum. And so it's hard to, even though in a district that prides itself on choice, the choice is actually a detriment to the for children. And in a city where families are transient because of housing costs and because of employment, this is an added threat to the vitality, educational vitality for kids and for the city. Very high teacher attrition. What's interesting, I was actually looking up this data to kind of get a sense of teacher attrition, and what I learned is that the State Board of Ed has allowed schools, charter schools do not have to report teacher data. So whatever you hear about teacher data in New Orleans, in Louisiana, often excludes New Orleans because charter schools don't have to report that data. So we actually don't know a lot about teacher attrition since, and this has been since the takeover in 2005, we don't know a lot because charter schools are exempted from sharing that data. So some of the things that have come out of my research, obviously I'm really interested in the curricular piece because I was a teacher, so I'm really interested in kind of how kids are navigating schools with such unstable curriculum, and not even to mention the teachers, but also the presence of nonprofits, and the shelf life of a nonprofit just in general is very short. They crop up in New Orleans almost on any idea you can think of. There's a new nonprofit. They don't last very long, but New Orleans is in some ways served as a test market for educational nonprofits, without any regard to, again, the threat that it causes for the vitality of kids' education in New Orleans. And so I'm really interested in kind of how this manifests across content areas. But I say all that to say that these threats have concerned me in large part because of what it's doing to kids and children and just the city in general. And so I, through these questions that have emerged for me, I have started to work over the last several years with community groups, grassroots, just regular, parents and teachers who have wanted to organize to resist all of this. And what they typically don't have access to is data and research and kind of hard and fast information about the dynamic changes that are happening. So some of the questions that are emerging for me, I'm sorry, this is, let me go back. Kind of a new one is the COVID-19 piece. We've been living through this for the last almost 2 years now. I'm really interested in kind of how this is changing the training of teachers and school leaders, and then obviously the enrollment issues that continue to plague us. I've had an opportunity to talk to attorneys. So as we think about the organizing piece, is there a legal route, and talk to attorneys about disparate impact lawsuits. And so we're looking at kind of all facets of how do we affect change to kind of the continuing racial inequities. What are the impacts of racial diversity trainings because of the even before George Floyd, but certainly since the George Floyd incidents and Breonna Taylor incidents, nonprofits and schools have claimed some interest in racial equity and diversity training in New Orleans. They are supposedly really animated about it. And so what does this mean materially for students and teachers and communities in terms of the change positively on their experiences in schools? We don't know anything about it yet. There's a ton of money for groups to earn on this kind of work, but what does it do for the people who are experiencing it? What I think about community-based research, And Tanya, I'm sorry if you've been telling me to stop talking and I've missed it.
No, Dr. Dixon,
okay.
you have 4 minutes. You're
Okay,
fine.
good.
Keep going.
Yeah.
You're good.
So I think in terms of community-based research, that we obviously have to think about community partnerships. We need to kind of somehow work with school leadership and look at policies, think carefully about teaching and learning, and then what are what I'm calling ecological equity and support. So what do we need to do to, as university people and as researchers, to support organizing efforts, and the shifts that people identify in their communities. What I think the researcher can do is to help, continue to help document what I've found in New Orleans since 2005 is just the kind of embargo of information, and the pushback that communities that folk have been engaged in New Orleans is there's a narrative that it's successful, and it's not. For the people on the ground, it's not successful, and the remaking of the city has not been quote unquote successful for, again, the people on the ground. So we can kind of help document policies and practices that obstruct community engagement in public education, help community-based organizations access information related to public education, again, just how we can leverage the resources that we have to access information from state boards of ed, federal data, and so on. Recast education research to be more dynamic and supportive of organizing efforts, and then leverage our internal and external resources to support organizing campaigns and efforts to reshape public education. So where this sounds, I know it sounds really researchy and academic.
You're at 2 minutes. Dr.
I'm at
Dixon.
2 minutes. So I've been
Yes.
thinking about kind of how I can use my resources and my kind of foot in the academic world to support the organizing efforts. I think a lot of it is a documentation, publishing, speaking at conferences, and using grant support, grant funds to provide time and effort towards organizing. So I will stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Dixon. Wow, you've left us with so many gems, which we are going to be excited to talk about once we hear from our next speakers. So I'd like to now open the floor for commentary from Ms. Karen Marshall.
I'm excited to be here, so thank you for having me here. And to all the attendees that I cannot see right now, appreciate y'all coming. And also what Dr. Dixon has just presented gives me a perfect kind of jump off point for a few things. I won't take up too much time. I will at first tell you about my organization, and then try to talk about, what we do in relation to organizing around equitable education, but specifically hone in on sort of university partnerships when it comes to organizing work, and what we've experienced, but what we think could be better. So Rethink New Orleans, we're about to celebrate our 15-year anniversary. We began in 2006, post-Katrina. And we're an organization that works with young people between the ages of 14 and 25, Black youth in New Orleans between the ages of 14 and 25. And our goal is, in particular, to support working class youth of color in New Orleans to become incredibly thoughtful and capable leaders through the process of really critically analyzing their education in the education system and working collectively to transform it. Yeah, 15 years. So, in those 15 years, our work has definitely developed. It's advanced in many ways. I'll say that we begin with someone who first comes sort of through the door at Rethink. The process begins with actually having a really good understanding of what it means to be Black, what it means to be Latinx, what it means to be. We also have a very strong Vietnamese population, even in New Orleans. So even though we're probably 90% Black in terms of our participants, we start off with what it means to be a person of color, socially and politically. And the reason we talk about that is because that is what matters when we're talking about systemic isms, is in terms of the economic system we're in terms of the school system we're in, what is that interplay, the dynamic between the race we represent and that particular system? What is it? So what it means politically and socially is incredibly important. So we start to ground that. And then look at the experience, both individual and collective, in the schools based on that. Many of the young people at first, it's just trying to understand what it means, what is the experience of school and how do we understand it from a sort of race and class lens. And then they start thinking through what it's going to take to transform and shift the school and therefore their particular experience in the school. We actually do this because we think, for one, education is incredibly important. And it does shape your experience within a school system from K through 12, shapes your understanding of how the world operates, shapes your ability to sort of move through the world post high school, whether it's graduation or you've been sort of unceremoniously pushed out because of your background. But it shapes all of these things. This is the main system, one of the main systems in a young person's life that they interact with every single day. And it provides a really incredible space for analysis and understanding how larger systems work. So one of the things I want to sort of share when it comes to education organizing and when it comes to university partnerships, I know as an organization, that develops organizers, Black organizers who are organizing around education, is that very often when we're approached about a partnership with a university, about a research partnership, it's often one way. So the type of research that is proposed is one in which would support the researcher in moving what it is that they're trying to move. And it's not really supportive of either our work or our young people. And it engages our young people or the community as a kind of tokens. So we're very cautious about what kind of partnerships we're willing to accept and we're willing to pursue. Because it's very, very important for us that our young people are part of a process for change and transformation, and not a part of another space where it's a transactional relationship. So with that in mind, I actually think a lot about the ways in which the education our young people are actually receiving through the schools. Adrienne actually has named the ways in which New Orleans public schools, definitely the way in which the school is privatized and charterized has actually further marginalized a lot of our students. So when we think of education equity within the context of school K through 12, there's a couple of questions that we're always asking, we're thinking about, so that we can understand what the experience really is. And I would actually say that liberatory education has to think through what is being taught, not only in the traditional curriculum, but what is being taught through the practices the schools engages, the policies that the school enacts. How is it being taught? And the same thing, curriculum, practices, and policy. And then also, I would say it's how the school sees itself in relation to the community. So in a transactional relationship, most often, even the most progressive charter schools or spaces sort of see themselves as in the community, not necessarily of the community. So it's still a transactional kind of tokenized relationship with folks who live around the community, parents of students and students, and it's a very extractive relationship. And then when we're talking about something that should be transformative, it should be a place where a school is seen as one part of a larger community, not necessarily separate from. But in the way that school operates often within a market-based system, it's traditionally seen as like something external that's coming into a place that's going to completely transform the place, not unlike a missionary kind of mindset. And we are very leery of those kinds of things. And I name those things because that is sometimes how we're even approached by institutions of higher education who want to partner with us to do study on, you know, the Rethinkers are doing such great work, or these students are amazing. We want to understand urban education, and it's a similar kind of mindset. So we have to be very careful of kind of approaching from that particular very capitalist kind of like mindset or extractive mindset.
Ms. Marshall, you have 2 minutes.
Yes.
I just wanted to, I'm sorry to interrupt, 2 minutes.
No, it's okay. So then I would actually say that as we're looking at these partnerships, we have to define what we're trying to move within in terms of education, how we understand it as a part of a larger system. And in terms of partnership, we're always looking for, in terms of research that will further the development of young people as incredible strategists and organizers and leaders. Leadership that will support the knowledge of the base that we're trying to build, either elevate that knowledge to a space where other people understand it, or support like more in-depth knowledge, and actually support like moving the kind of things that we need to move for transformation. If it's research that is mainly tailored towards kind of a status quo audience, then we're not necessarily interested in it. But if it's research that's going to help move us towards the transformation that's necessary, that's the kind of relationship we think is incredibly possible. And the last thing I'll say with that is, or incredibly necessary. And the last thing I'll say with that is that also where it is we're trying to bring this information or knowledge, whatever the report is. So I'm okay if we're presenting at larger conferences or what have you, as long as in addition to that, we're presenting to the same people in our community so that it helps us kind of shore up our strategy, advance some of our strategy, and advance some of the things we're trying to do to create transformation. And if we're not going to be able to do that, then it doesn't feel like a useful partnership for me. And I'll just pause there. So.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ms. Marshall. You have also given us something to think more deeply about in connection with Dr. Dixon's words. I now would like to move to Ms. Hurd, Ms. Arlyssa Hurd. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and thank you. You know, it's so funny because listening to Dr. Dixon and Ms. Karen right before us, it sounds so much like we're talking about the same thing in the same city. Dr. Dixon referenced Detroit a lot in her presentation and just made it really easy. But I did want to just start off a little bit about telling a little bit about 482 Forward. You know, 482 Forward, we are a collection of parents, students, community residents, and coalition partners, and we fight for education justice. I tell people all the time that we don't have any superstars on our team. We really just look like some regular old people, but we're strong and we fight. And I think it's because our collective voice rings so loud and we connect so much with people on the issues that we just can't be forgotten. We strongly believe that we have the right to help find solutions to challenges within our schools and in our communities. And by the way, some people ask that 482, that's really strange for a name. 482, especially for those who do not live in Michigan, 482 are the first 3 digits of all the zip codes in the city of Detroit. And that name, actually, I am one of the founding members of 482. That name came out of the community as a result of forming our organization. We're relatively young, less than 6 years old, but we have definitely managed to shift the conversation of education in the state of Michigan as a result of not just our efforts, but our efforts and our parents and community and coalition partners as well. I have to really start with some of the chaotic craziness that really started this off in the first place. And the city of Detroit is very unique. We probably about maybe 20 years ago or so, I'm a parent. I got in this game. It's so funny when my bio was being read, I was like, wow, how many of us actually get into doing anything that our degree says that we do? I got into this game because I had a child in the system and I couldn't figure out what was wrong. I spent a lot of time screaming and hollering at principals, always was a parent leader in the schools. And I knew something was wrong, but just couldn't quite figure out. Well, it wasn't until later in connecting with, activists and forming groups at 482, we figured out that these issues were systemic. And unless we addressed these systemic issues and found and dug deeper into these layers, nothing was going to change. And also discovering that the entire purpose of the research, the digging, the entire purpose of it all is to move policy. And if policy isn't moving, nothing else is probably moving too much in the world in which we live in. If we ever change that system and how this world or this country operates, then maybe, but for now, policy is where it's at. So for us, some may know, Detroit was under this cloud of emergency management for years. Depending on who you ask, Detroit pretty much just had Detroit public school system. That was it for years. Many of us came out of that system, but somewhere around in the late 1990s, 2000s, Detroit public schools had a surplus. The powers that be, political structure said they didn't. And before you know it, lots of moves were made. And before you know it, Detroit was up under different forms of emergency management for the next 10, 15 years. And as a result of that, in addition to that, I should say, there was a lot of decline in our Detroit public school system. There was lots of decline in the city. Many folks had moved out. I'm sure we all see this in urban areas across the country. And as a result, we had the Detroit public schools had pretty much around the year 2000, had roughly more than 150,000 kids enrolled. And basically today, just to give you an example, there's less than about 50,000 kids enrolled in Detroit public schools. What we also saw during that time was the door open for charter school system. Now, I have to say right here that our organization is not anti-charter schools. We just want things to be right, but what we are anti is lack of transparency and accountability. And what we were finding more often than not is that this is what began to happen. There was an influx of charter schools. Charters were supposedly coming in to enhance education, to make things better. But we later found out that things actually got worse. Around the years of 2013, 14, we discovered that schools were opening and closing all over the place in Detroit. There was really no process. We had schools that were closing without warning. Parents would show up with their kids one day, and in 2 weeks later, the school is closed with a sign on it. We also found that schools were opening up in neighborhoods where it wasn't needed. So we began to talk to parents, do some listening, do some research, and what we found out is all across the city that this was happening, but no one was talking about it. There was really no research about this. So we had to basically create our own. And I know we're talking about research and community, and that's kind of where I wanted to make this point, that for us, the starting point is community. We just pretty much believe that the beginning of our work starts with the community, families, and students. All of our research work is community-based. And oftentimes what we have found in these last few years is that a lot of times organizations will have plans already designed, schools will have plans designed, and they will come to community to sign on with what the plan is, instead of allowing their plans to be community-driven or parent-led or student-led. We talk about that. We hear people say that all the time. Those are beautiful buzzwords. They say it all the time. But when you really look down at it, that's not really how it goes. We realized that when we started, most research was done by outside academics and organizations. But we needed to create our own research so that we can define our own research questions and those questions that most impacted us and created more educational injustice for us. We actually ended up, as a result of this closing and opening schools business, this is pretty much what launched our organization pretty much out the gate. We actually created a map to show, and my apologies that I do not have that map to show you, but I could get it back if folks are interested. We actually created a map to show where schools really were. And what we found out was that we had school deserts all over the place, where we had too many kids and not enough schools. And then we discovered that there were more schools popping up in areas where there seemed to be more development, or how our cities are being rebuilt and appealing to more folks outside of the city. We noticed that there were schools in those areas, but not enough kids. All of this going back and forth just really created a lot of chaos and complete nightmares for our parents. And it seemed as if, though, not a whole lot of people were really raising enough hell about it, or they were talking a good game, but there was not a lot being done. So as we began to research and to connect with more parents and connect with community, people began to find out that not only were there concerns and issues happening in the charter schools, but also in our traditional public schools. We began to look at questions like, what really is school quality in the first place? Do parents really know what that is? What exactly are we talking about? We began to look at things like classroom size. We had 40 kids. For example, my son, who has an IEP, who has special needs, was in a classroom with 40 kids in third grade. This is my time.
I'm sorry, you have 2 minutes. Go ahead.
Okay.
2 minutes.
And this is some of the things that we basically addressed. I know my time is short, but I do just want to share this. I do believe that as we continue on this work, that researchers and our research definitely need to depend on the expertise of the community and the organizers and the people who are impacted the most. We have a saying in 482 that there will be nothing about us without us. And we really mean that. I just find that once we are community driven, if we are driven and led by our parents, teachers, and students, and really considering community voice, I think it points us in the right direction, and we are headed for that systemic change that so many of us are fighting for. And I'll stop right there because I don't want to run over my time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arlyssa Hurd. And we're just really seeing this beautiful and lovely thread through the conversation between the three of you. We are now going to shift to welcoming in for additional commentary, Dr. Wilson.
Great. Thank you all again. So wonderful to hear from you. I'm just going to be brief in noting some key themes that have come up across all three speakers' comments that have been so important. I'm going to hone in on the implications for university and community research partnerships. Going back to Dr. Dixon's emphasis on how she believes university-based researchers can, quote, help document policies and practices that obstruct full community engagement in public education, end quote. And from that, Ms. Marshall just emphasized our need to move beyond the tokenizing, extractive, and capitalistic models of university research collaboration. So wonderfully said. Calling universities out, unfortunately, for a legacy that has been exploitative, quite frankly, particularly in communities of color and particularly in communities highly impacted by poverty, right? So all of our speakers are calling us to task, those of us anchored in academia to do much better. And of course, the CREATE Center is dedicated to that and bringing folks together to empower us and collaborate to do such justice-driven work. So moving beyond these tokenizing partnerships to a transformative partnership model is crucial. And Ms. Hurd, similarly, as Ms. Marshall, emphasized the importance of community members having their self-determination honored by university researchers, and us as university researchers, knowing that community members' agenda setting is most important in our research with them, right? So ultimately, research needs to be leveraged to make just changes in policy and practice. And it should be, if we call ourselves being community engaged, community-based, then much of our research should be community-driven. I want to especially commend Rethink in New Orleans and give an additional shout out to 482 Forward, because these are both organizations that also involve youth and advocacy and give platform to youth organizers to further their own self-determination as well. So they have a platform to affect social change and educational justice. And these are the issues that affect them the most in their education and their life. And so I know Dr. Neff Chang has dropped in links to the community-based organizations we've heard about today, in addition to a link to Dr. Dixon's podcast. So please use those resources to learn more about the great information that you've heard. Also, I want to just reflect a little bit on my own collaboration, as for an example, working with 482 Forward, and the ways that my team that have consisted of several doctoral and master's students here at Michigan have really strived to do our best to implement the various things that Dr. Dixon and also Ms. Hurd and Ms. Marshall have called for. And that is always thinking about researcher reciprocity, right? Yes, in academia, we write, we publish, we are absolutely expected to. However, to do community engaged and community-based work that is justice driven, we have to also think, how do we give back immediately? And how do we help community members and on community members' terms, right? And so one important element that was a part of the CREATE study model was embedding participatory action research. And so while we both studied 482 Forward's leadership and learning, we also had a very meaningful piece of the work that was driven by the organizers. The organizers set the research questions, and we helped nurture the participatory action research arm that they now have, and it's completely self-sustaining, and that they have expanded and also very much include the youth organizers in as well. In addition, we were sure to have participant observer models of the research so that university researcher team members were also actively giving, actively contributing within the organizing spaces. Dr. Ransom is one of those former researchers and participant observers in the youth advocacy space, particularly, and also Naomi May, who will soon be a doctor as well, has been one of those participant observers and contributors. So that model has worked, I think, well for us, though it's important that I keep pushing myself, we all keep pushing ourselves to do more and to do better as university researchers, and just continue to learn so much from the insight, the struggle, the brilliance that we have heard here today, not only from a university researcher like Dr. Dixon, but those on the ground fighting for justice in community-based spaces every day, like Ms. Marshall and Ms. Hurd. So thank you so much again.
Wonderful. Wonderful comments all the way around. And now we would like to begin to take questions from the audience. Before we do that though, I would like to invite our speakers, all of our speakers, to talk or to give us a few comments if they would like regarding the issues that have been discussed today, and really thinking about these intersections between the work of university researchers, the dismantling of schools in Black and Brown communities and in urban centers, and the self-determination of community-based organizations and parents and youth. So are there any comments that you all would like to talk with each other about? Thank you.
Yeah, I actually just really wanted to add, and I wanted to just emphasize again, I just think that when it comes to this, when we're talking about universities and research and organizations, and certainly here in Detroit, from the schools to different organizations like ours, we definitely have seen and have worked with several folks from the universities, but I think it is important to keep the main thing, and really be led of the people that you are working with who are the most impacted. I can't emphasize that enough. We've seen all kinds of research projects that have come into our cities where people have told us that they had good intentions and they have all of this data and all of these people, and they want to do all of these wonderful things, and then they get their research and their data and they're gone. And when you look at it, it's none of the stuff that it hasn't been beneficial to the community. It doesn't benefit anything. It was more like an experiment or project, or that's what these people do. I just think for it to be genuine, for it to be true, that we need to listen to the voices of the people that we're talking to and let them lead the process and shape what it is that we're researching. If as much as possible, let that be the shape of things and not necessarily have a plan before you show up, so to speak. But I just wanted to add that.
Yeah. Go ahead, Kay. Go ahead.
Yeah, I appreciate, thank you, Arlyssa, for saying that the main thing needs to be the main thing, because that's so real and that's incredibly true. And I just wanted to add to that in terms of knowledge, because I think there's like a sort of larger piece in place that we actually have to kind of tussle with in terms of developing knowledge, trying to attain knowledge, and that you actually have to To actually like know something, to really, really know it, you actually have to participate in the struggle to change it. And so our sort of what we would like to see from folks and what we've requested, and it actually has worked pretty well from folks who approach us and say they want to be research partners with us, is that like, okay, so you have to participate in some of the things that we're trying to do in terms of learn to do the organizing that we're doing, understand the analysis that we're coming with when we talk about capitalism and extraction and how that works. You really have to do it because you have to be a part of the struggle to change something in order to really, really, really understand it. And with that, I would say in terms of the production of knowledge and the production, like whatever it's going to be, the report or what have you, we have to ask the question of who it's going to be for. And so, you know, again, to like look at extraction is when I was talking about like capitalism, but if it's just being produced just to produce, or just so other folks can kind of like hoard it, similar to the way that money can be hoarded and other resources can be hoarded, we have no interest in it. But if it's being produced so that like, as Arlyssa has mentioned, like the people can actually use it, can grow from it, can access more resources from it, can advance our struggle, then that's then that is what is primary. And then the last thing that I'll say is that in a larger context, education can't actually be separated from the economy that it's meant to sustain. And so when we're actually thinking about the cultural practices, the economy that it's trying to sustain, I actually try to, when folks approach us in terms of like researching, I'm trying to understand if the research is meant to sustain this very same economy, or are we trying to actually disrupt status quo and actually move towards something completely different? And that's the lens through which, or these are the questions we're always asking when it comes to engaging in some kind of partnership, when folks approach us with some kind of partnership. And then the final point, the last thing is that I want to know if after this research is done, so like the process of transformation everybody has to participate in it. And so like after this research is done, is the researcher just going to go back? Or are they now committing to moving and transforming the thing that they actually now understand more deeply because they participated in the struggle?
So I appreciate all of those comments. I've learned a lot just working with KG and Rethink. One of them has been around language and describing the young people that participate in Rethink as young people and not kids and children. So really thinking about kind of adultism and how that informs even what I imagine the work to be when working with young people. But I will say this. So I teach a course on researching race, and so I'm going to speak to mostly the university people, graduate students, professors, is in my, when I've gone out and given presentations on what's happening in New Orleans, and my orientation to the work has been to speak back to the kind of grand narratives that the reforms in New Orleans are quote unquote working, that what was in place in New Orleans before Katrina was dysfunctional, and and so it had to be remade. There are two points I want to make about that. One is overwhelmingly most of the teachers in New Orleans were African-American women. And so you would have to believe then that African-American women were incapable of educating Black children and leading schools that Black children lived in. Because we hold such a poor and negative set of beliefs about the capacity of Black people to take care of themselves and their children, we will believe that casting of Black women as being unable to educate our children. And so part of my work is to reject that narrative. And I'm really committed to it for personal reasons, but also I just think it's damaging. But the other piece is to, again, speak to, because this model of reforming public education will be and is in a city near you, and most of those cities are Black and brown cities. And that concerns me. And to kind of Karen's bigger point is kind of understanding what is the broader landscape. And so, yes, there is something happening in New Orleans that concerns me, but wherever Black children are and Black people live, these reforms are coming because there's an underlying set of beliefs, again, about the worth of Black people, such that we can, to Miss Arlyssa's point earlier, we can experiment, we can try out ideas that have been untested that we would not do in predominantly white elite spaces. But it is acceptable to go in and completely eradicate Black institutions and Black spaces. And I would imagine that if we were in Houston and in LA and places where there are predominantly Latinx students, this is similar patterns of eradication of places that Black and brown people inhabit. It is okay to wipe them away and quote unquote start anew in a remaking that a power elite has designed. And I think it's important to say that people of color have been complicit in what's happened in New Orleans. I think that's a larger part of the kind of work, the ideology of white supremacy that operates, that people have internalized. But I think it's important that you have a sense of what your project is. So when I teach courses on researching race and I give talks, I've had people say, well, isn't this just, you're doing political research? And I would argue that if you're not, whatever we're doing is political, right? If you're quote unquote agnostic about the reforms, that is a political position. That is a political position of not caring and being blind to how people are suffering, because people are suffering in cities that are being reformed. They're suffering because they're being displaced. As cities get reformed, they are increasingly gentrified and unaffordable. We lose housing. Places where people were employed, industries crop up, but they are not offering livable wages, and that is devastating for people of color. And so, if you are silent or thinking that you're being objective, you have landed in a political position. And so, my political positionality is, yes, one of pushing back on processes and policies that reinforce racial inequality. And so I'm okay with that positioning. But I do say for my students that when researching race, there is a particular aim, and it's for liberation. And it's one that I was oriented to, but also to point them to literature. So I would encourage folks to read Tukufu Zuberi, who's at University of Pennsylvania, who has done a lot of work around demystifying quantitative approaches to research. And people are enamored with quantitative research because they believe that it is quote unquote objective and scientific. And he takes all of that to task as someone who's trained in statistical and quantitative methods. And so I have my students read a number of his books and articles, but there's one piece in particular that he wrote in the University of Connecticut Law Review, where he talks about racial research has a Black liberatory aim, that it should be aimed at racial equity and liberation. And if that's not what you're working for, then what do why are you researching race? So that is the premise that I use in my research courses. And I would encourage my colleagues that as everyone is interested in racial equity and systemic understanding systemic racism, and we're going to undo this and we're going to undo that. What are you undoing? And what are you imagining the new thing will be if it's not to KG's point earlier, eradicating a system of oppression? And how are we participating in that as university people? And so I think we have to be explicit about naming our projects and the ideologies that undergird our projects. And I'll stop there.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. This conversation has been so fruitful. I'm going to shift to Q&A. And Paula Pfeffer ask a question that aligns with something that both Dr. Dixon has said and our activists have also mentioned. So the two organizations here have been working in either Detroit or New Orleans for a very long time. I think Rethink is 15 years, 482 may be longer than that. We saw in Dr. Dixon's presentation that although community-based organizations are doing great work in New Orleans and in other places around the country, it's very difficult to sustain these efforts as organizations. And so Paula's question states that they opened the Ann Arbor Community Learning Center after they found out that Ann Arbor public schools were going to stay remote for the most of the school year. And although the Community Learning Center has been helping undocumented immigrants since the beginning of the school year, they are struggling with getting funding since they are an immigrant-led grassroots organization. Any advice on how to sustain and move forward to best help students who came to the Learning Center?
I can actually start off and kind of pass the mic for folks. So, sustainability there's a couple of, sort of prongs to sustainability. You want to be able to sustain it economically, obviously, financially, to just have the resources to keep it open. But also, I think being able to sustain the relationships of folks in the community that are using the center. And I think most critically, actually sustain like the single vision and the mission is actually the most key to actually sustaining resources. There are a few since last year, given the pandemic, there are definitely, I'm willing to talk offline about like various funders that have been interested and willing to support projects like this, education projects like this. And I would say even with those funders willing to be on board, if you get in contact with them, willing to be on board, the most crucial aspect of sustaining something like this more than a year, over like 5 years, what have you, is to be very, very clear about what it is you're doing and how it is you're trying to do it. And to have like a very clear method of developing staff. I think very often, once we hire staff, we think like they're just supposed to do their job, which they are, there's nothing wrong with that. But in order to actually grow, we actually have to be very, very committed to like developing staff and developing like as individually in order to grow their skills in the work, but also collectively. And that also involves their willingness to be deeply grounded and connected to the community that you're sort of working with. And that ability to do that, sustain the development of staff and actually sustain the connection to the community is what allows you to continue to get funding and get funding that doesn't like include mission drift. Because whether they're mean to or not, mostly they don't mean to, funders will almost always suggest that you do something that has little to nothing to do with what you're actually trying to do. And often if you're just like very gracious and clear about what it is you're really trying to do and stay with the mission, you can actually continue growing in a really meaningful way. So like I said, I'm willing to have support, provide, I guess I could provide an email address to talk offline about who to pursue in terms of funding for things like this. But I think outside of that, just having a solid understanding, a way to continue to make sure you're grounded in and connected to the community and to build and support your staff is the most important.
Yeah, I wanted to chime in, and I misunderstood in the beginning. I thought it was a question specifically about funding, but because it is Ann Arbor and because in 482, we work with a number of undocumented families. Some of our youth are undocumented. And so we definitely have coalition partners who are definitely connected deep into our work. So what I want to offer is my contact information so that I can connect the two. And our resources and some of our coalition partners may have some definitely ways that they can go about and connect with others and find what they're looking for as well.
And so I'll just offer some observations. I think, and one of the things that Karen and I are trying to work on is, and this has been an ongoing effort, it's not new, but working across organizations. And so that's the long organizational kind of organizing arc, is being able to remain connected. So that when something happens, and we experienced in New Orleans, we could experience Katrina. Ironically, no one, no one asked necessarily directly how one keeps school going in the face of a pandemic. And what was even more interesting is that the ed reformers seemed to have no idea what to do when the pandemic hit, and it was like, well, we just went through Katrina, So we actually had experience with the loss of an infrastructure and having to kind of keep schools online, and they seem to be continuing to build. We're just unprepared. But from a community-based perspective, it's maintaining connections so that we are prepared for the inevitable, right? And I think we've done some of that. We're having conversations with what that can look like after COVID, and where spaces will be. I think one of the things that in New Orleans, at least because of the way it is that it has to be multiple sites and not one site, but that maintaining those relationships across organizations. And I think to Karen's point earlier is the funding. Often the funding feeds this kind of silo effect and cannibalizing of each other, but the building the relationship and the organizing, across time and space is helpful for when we need to find alternative spaces other than traditional school spaces.
You're muted, Kim.
Thank you. I was muted. Sorry. I was just saying, wow, this has been a very wonderful conversation. A lot of gems dropped here today at the intersection of research, community-based work, all towards the transformation of education in Black and Brown communities, with New Orleans and Detroit being our spaces of knowledge building and work today. I want to, or we, the Create Center, would like to thank everyone, our esteemed panelists, Dr. Dixson, Ms. Marshall, Ms. Hurd, and all of our esteemed guests out there in the Zoom cyberspace world for attending today. We are really looking forward to having more conversations around community-based work and research and activism towards transforming education for our communities. I also would like to make a shameless plug. Students, if you've enjoyed our circle today, we encourage you to be on the lookout for our postdoctoral research fellow, i.e. me, who will be conducting an ethno-historical methods workshop soon. If you're interested in data collection, analysis, oral histories, materials, images, and public scholarship working with and in collaboration with communities, you might not want to miss this opportunity. And a flyer is in the chat for you. I will now turn the Zoom floor back to Dr. Wilson.
So likewise, just thank you all for joining us today. I know it's been an extended period in terms of having a 90-minute session, but as you've heard, I think we've absolutely needed it. And Dr. Dixson, Ms. Marshall, Ms. Hurd, just again, your brilliance, your generosity is so much appreciated. And your struggle and fight, resilience, that makes such a difference, not only in your own communities, but for all of us. So thank you, everyone. And yes, be on the lookout for the workshop that Dr. Ransom mentioned. And it's almost an end of the academic school year. So I also want to wish folks a happy, peaceful, safe, and healthy summer. Thank you so much.
Thank you. This was great. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.